Sometimes, the most dangerous man in the room is the one no one bothers to understand. The night air was thick with humidity, streetlights casting long yellow shadows across the pavement as Officer Ryan Blake stepped out of his patrol car, eyes locked on a single figure standing quietly near the curb. A black man in a simple dark jacket, hands visible, posture calm. But to Ryan, calm wasn't innocence. It was suspicion, it was attitude, it was a challenge to authority he believed he owned. "Hey you," Ryan called out, voice sharp enough to cut through the distant hum of traffic. "What are you doing here?" The man turned slowly, no sudden movements, no panic, just a steady gaze that seemed to take in everything at once. Every detail, every badge, every unspoken assumption hanging in the air. "Just heading home," he said, voice even, controlled. But Ryan had already made up his mind long before the answer came. Because in his world, decisions weren't based on facts, they were based on instinct, and his instincts had never failed him. Or at least that's what he told himself. "Yeah? Doesn't look like it," Ryan muttered, stepping closer, the weight of his badge heavy on his chest, the quiet confidence of someone who had never been questioned, never been challenged, never been forced to answer for the lines he crossed. And within seconds, backup lights flashed. Another unit pulling up, two more officers stepping out, their presence turning a simple moment into something bigger, something louder, something public. People across the street slowed, phones subtly raised, eyes watching, waiting, judging. And still, the man didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, letting it unfold, as if he had seen this scene play out before, as if he already knew how it would end. "Turn around," Ryan ordered, and the man complied without hesitation, the quiet click of cuffs echoing just enough to draw more attention, more whispers, more assumptions. And that's when Ryan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make it personal. "You. People always think you can just walk wherever you want," he said, the words dripping with something deeper than authority, something colder. And for the first time, the man spoke again, softer this time, but sharper. "You're making a mistake," he said, not as a warning, not as a plea, but as a statement. And Ryan laughed under his breath, shaking his head as if he had heard it 1,000 times before. "Yeah, they all say that," he replied, guiding him toward the car, the scene already fading into routine in his mind. Just another stop, just another name, just another report to file and forget. But as the door closed and the man sat inside, his eyes didn't drop, didn't show fear, didn't show anger. They stayed steady, focused, watching Ryan like a man observing something already decided, already written. And as the patrol car pulled away, the city lights blurred past the window, reflecting in those same calm eyes, and in a voice barely above a whisper, almost lost beneath the hum of the engine, he said one more thing, not to Ryan, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself. "Make sure your cameras stay on." And somewhere between the flashing lights and the silence that followed, something shifted, something subtle, something no one there noticed yet, because, to them, this was just another arrest, just another night. But to him, it was the beginning of the end. The station felt different once the doors closed behind him, the outside noise fading into a low hum replaced by fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, and the distant echo of phones ringing somewhere down the hall. But inside the booking area, everything moved with a cold, practiced rhythm. Paperwork shuffled, keyboards clicked, officers exchanged casual remarks as if nothing about the moment mattered, as if the man sitting quietly in front of them was just another name to process and forget. Ethan Cole remained still, his hands resting calmly in front of him, posture straight, eyes moving slowly from one detail to another, the badge numbers on uniforms, the names stitched above pockets, the cameras mounted high in the corners. Nothing escaped his attention, not even the way one younger officer hesitated for half a second longer than the others, glancing at Ethan as if something about him did not quite match the situation. "Name," Ryan Blake said flatly, not looking up from the form in front of him, pen tapping impatiently against the paper. Ethan's voice came steady, controlled. "Ethan Cole." And for a brief moment the pen stopped, just a fraction of a second, before continuing again. "Address," Ryan asked, tone unchanged, and Ethan answered without hesitation, each word precise, deliberate. as if every answer was being placed exactly where it needed to be, not rushed, not defensive, just certain. Around them the room carried on. Another officer laughed at something on his phone. Someone poured stale coffee into a chipped mug. A radio crackled with distant chatter, all of it blending into a background noise that made the scene feel smaller than it was, routine, ordinary, forgettable. But there was nothing ordinary about the way Ethan observed it. Nothing forgettable about the quiet awareness in his eyes. When Ryan finally looked up, there was a flicker of irritation, something about the calmness in front of him that did not sit right. "You got anything on you I need to know about?" he asked, leaning back slightly, trying to reclaim the sense of control he was used to. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "Nothing you would understand," he replied, not disrespectful, not aggressive, just honest, and that answer lingered in the air longer than expected, long enough for the younger officer to shift his weight uncomfortably, long enough for Ryan's jaw to tighten before he forced a dismissive scoff. "We will see about that," he said, pushing the form aside and signaling toward the holding area. Minutes later the cell door closed with a solid, final sound that echoed through the narrow corridor. And just like that, the system moved on. Another file, another entry, another moment erased from importance. But inside the cell Ethan did not pace, did not call out, did not show frustration. He simply sat down on the bench, back straight, hands resting loosely, eyes lifting once toward the small camera mounted in the corner, and for the first time since the night began, the faintest hint of something shifted in his expression, not fear, not anger, but recognition, as if confirming something already known, somewhere down the hall. Ryan leaned against the desk, flipping through paperwork. With casual confidence. "Guy thinks he is special," he muttered to a colleague, earning a quiet chuckle in return. "They all do," someone replied, and the conversation moved on just as quickly as it started, but not everyone was laughing. The younger officer lingered near the doorway, glancing once more toward the holding cell, something about the man inside refusing to settle into the usual narrative. Because most people argued, most people panicked, most people tried to explain themselves. But this one, he waited, and waiting like that, without fear, without urgency, felt different, felt wrong, like watching a clock tick down without knowing what would happen when it reached zero. Hours passed slowly, the station growing quieter as the night stretched on, the energy fading into a dull, mechanical routine, and still, Ethan remained exactly where he was, unmoving, composed, his silence louder than anything said around him, and just before the lights dimmed slightly for the overnight shift, he spoke again, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, but just enough for the camera to catch it. "This is all on record," he said calmly, eyes steady, voice clear, and then he leaned back slightly, as if settling into place, as if the waiting part was over, and whatever came next had already been set in motion. By the time midnight settled into the bones of the building, the station had changed, not in noise but in weight. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears, where every small sound feels louder than it should, a chair shifting, a pen tapping, the low murmur of a late-night dispatch call drifting through the halls. And still, in the holding cell, Ethan Cole had not moved much at all. His posture remained steady, his breathing slow, controlled, as if time itself had no authority over him, as if the hours passing meant nothing. And that was what began to unsettle the few who noticed. Because time always changes people in places like this. It wears them down, makes them restless, makes them speak. But Ethan did none of that. He simply observed, his eyes lifting occasionally to the small camera in the corner, then drifting back to the empty space in front of him, as if replaying something only he could see. Down the hall, Officer Ryan Blake sat at the desk with his sleeves rolled slightly, a half-finished report in front of him. Though his focus kept slipping, his pen hovering over the page longer than necessary, his mind returning again and again to the same detail he could not quite explain, the way that man had looked at him, not afraid, not angry, just certain, and certainty like that did not belong in a holding cell. "You still thinking about that guy?" another officer asked casually, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee. Ryan let out a short breath, shaking his head as if brushing it off. "No, just another stop," he replied. But even as he said it, the words felt thin, unconvincing, because somewhere beneath his confidence something had started to shift, Something small but persistent, like a crack forming where there had never been one before. Across the room, the younger officer, Daniel Ruiz, stood near the booking terminal, pretending to focus on paperwork but glancing toward the corridor more often than he realized. He had seen plenty of people come through those doors, angry, scared, confused, but never like this. Never someone who sat in silence as if they were exactly where they needed to be. It did not make sense, and the more it did not make sense, the harder it was to ignore. After a moment, Daniel spoke up quietly, not challenging, just curious. Did we run him through the system yet? Ryan looked up briefly, irritation flickering across his face. We will get to it, he said, tone clipped, dismissive, but Daniel hesitated, then added, I just mean. He gave his name like it mattered, and that was enough to earn a sharper look, the kind that reminded everyone in the room where authority sat. Everything matters on paper, Ryan replied, tapping the file in front of him, ending the conversation before it could go further. But the question lingered even after silence returned, because deep down, they all knew not every name carried the same weight. Time stretched on, the clock ticking past 1 in the morning, then 2, the station growing quieter, heavier, the energy draining into routine, and still Ethan remained exactly the same, until finally, sometime after 3, a small shift happened. He stood up slowly, not in frustration, not in urgency, just with purpose, stepping closer to the bars, not touching them, just standing there, looking out into the empty corridor, and in a voice calm enough to be mistaken for casual. He spoke, You should check your email. The words were simple, almost ordinary, but they landed differently, echoing just enough to reach the desk where Daniel stood, his head lifting slightly, eyes narrowing as if trying to understand. Ryan did not respond, did not even look up, dismissing it as another attempt to get attention. But Daniel hesitated, something about the timing, the tone, the certainty behind it, and after a few seconds he turned back to the terminal, fingers hovering over the keyboard before finally pressing a key. The screen flickered as the inbox loaded, rows of unread messages appearing, most routine, most expected, until one subject line caught his attention, marked urgent, time-stamped less than an hour ago, and as his eyes moved across the words, the color drained slightly from his face, his posture stiffening, his breath catching just enough to break the rhythm of the room. Because in that moment, something became clear, something none of them had considered, and slowly, almost without meaning to, Daniel looked up from the screen, his gaze shifting down the hallway toward the holding cell, where Ethan Cole now stood in the same calm stillness, watching, waiting, as if he already knew exactly what Daniel had just read, and exactly what would happen next. Daniel Ruiz did not move at first, his eyes locked on the screen as if reading the same line over and over again would somehow change what it said, the glow of the monitor reflecting faintly across his face while the rest of the station remained unaware, still wrapped in the slow rhythm of a quiet night. But something had shifted, something real, something undeniable, and for a moment he forgot to breathe. What is it? Ryan Blake's voice cut in, casual but edged with impatience, noticing the sudden stillness. Daniel hesitated, his throat tightening slightly before he spoke. It is an internal notice, he said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across thin ice. Ryan leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. So read it later, he replied, dismissive. But Daniel did not look away from the screen, his voice lower now, more focused. It says there is a new internal affairs assignment effective immediately. And that was enough to draw a few glances from the room. Not alarm. Not yet. Just curiosity. Because internal affairs was not something that showed up quietly. It was something that changed rooms when it entered. Something that made even confident officers straighten their posture. Ryan exhaled slowly, irritation creeping in. Then congratulations to whoever got the job, he said with a faint smirk. But Daniel still did not move, and now that hesitation began to spread. Subtle but noticeable, like a ripple across still water. It includes a name, Daniel added. And this time Ryan looked directly at him. Something sharper behind his eyes, something that had not been there before. Then say it, Ryan said, voice firmer now. And for a brief second the entire room seemed to pause without realizing it. Conversations fading, movement slowing. As Daniel finally turned his head, his gaze drifting down the hallway toward the holding cell, and then back again. "Ethan Cole," he said, and the name did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because the silence that followed carried more weight than any reaction could. Ryan did not respond immediately, his expression holding steady for just a moment too long, as if his mind was trying to reject the information before accepting it. "That is not possible," he said finally, the confidence in his voice thinner now, less certain. But Daniel did not argue. He simply turned the monitor slightly, just enough for Ryan to see, and there it was, clear, official, undeniable, the name. The title, the effective timestamp that matched the very moment they had brought him in. Not yesterday, not tomorrow, but now. And suddenly the room felt smaller, tighter, the air heavier than before. One of the other officers shifted uncomfortably. Another set his coffee down a little too quickly, the quiet confidence that had filled the space earlier now replaced by something else, something colder, something uncertain. And down the hallway, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been, calm, composed, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment to arrive. Ryan pushed himself up from the chair, slower than usual, his movements no longer careless, no longer automatic. Each step measured as he looked toward the corridor, toward the man he had already judged, already dismissed, already placed in a category that now no longer existed. "Stay here," he said, though the command lacked the force it once carried, and without waiting for a response he started walking down the hallway, the sound of his footsteps echoing against the floor, each step closing the distance between assumption and reality. And as he reached the bars of the holding cell, Ethan lifted his eyes to meet his. No anger, no satisfaction, just that same steady certainty, the kind that had been there from the beginning, the kind that Ryan had ignored. And for the first time since the night began, Ryan did not speak right away, because there are moments when words no longer belong to the person who used to have control, moments when everything that felt certain begins to unravel quietly. And in that silence, Ethan spoke first, his voice calm, almost gentle. "I told you," he said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple truth finally catching up to the moment. "You should have checked." Ryan Blake had spent years believing that control was something you carried, something stitched into your uniform, something people recognized the moment you stepped into a room. But standing there now, facing the man behind the bars, that belief began to feel thinner than it ever had before, because control does not disappear all at once. It slips, quietly, piece by piece. And in that moment, Ryan could feel it happening, not around him, but beneath him, like the ground was no longer as solid as it used to be. "Open the cell," he said finally, his voice measured, but lacking the edge it once held. And for a second no one moved, not because they did not hear him, but because the meaning behind those words had changed. This was no longer routine, no longer just another step in a process. Daniel stepped forward first, keys in hand, his movements careful, deliberate, as if aware that every action now carried weight. The lock clicked, the door opened slowly, and Ethan Cole stepped out. Without hesitation, not rushing, not lingering, simply walking forward with the same calm presence he had carried all night. And as he passed Ryan, there was no glance of triumph, no sign of resentment, just a quiet acknowledgement that needed no words. Back in the main room, the atmosphere had shifted completely, conversations had stopped, posture had changed, eyes followed Ethan as he moved, not as a suspect, not as a mistake, but as something else entirely, something none of them had prepared. For Daniel stood near the desk, the email still open on the screen, the official seal visible, the language clear, unmistakable, and for the first time since he had joined the force, he understood what it meant to witness a moment that would not be forgotten. Ethan stopped beside the desk, his gaze moving across the room, taking in each face. Again, but this time, the silence that followed him was different. It was not dismissive, it was not indifferent, it was aware. "I believe you have something for me," he said calmly, his voice steady, directed toward Daniel, who nodded slightly before turning the screen fully toward him. Ethan read it once, briefly, not because he needed to confirm it, but because everyone else needed to see that it was real, that it was official, that it was not something that could be ignored or explained away. And then he looked up, his eyes settling on Ryan. Not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that felt heavier than either. From this moment forward, he said, each word precise, leaving no space for misunderstanding. This station is under review. The words landed quietly, but their impact moved through the room like a current, officers shifting, glances exchanged. The weight of past actions suddenly no longer distant, no longer protected by routine. Ryan remained still, his hands resting at his sides, his posture straight. But something in his expression had changed, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the kind that comes when certainty begins to dissolve. If there has been any misunderstanding, Ryan began, his voice controlled, attempting to rebuild the structure he was used to standing on. But Ethan did not interrupt, he simply listened, allowing the words to finish, and then, just as calmly, he responded, "There is no misunderstanding," and that was the difference, because this was not a conversation about perception, it was about record, about what had already been captured, already documented, already set in motion long before this moment. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward the camera in the corner of the room, then back again. "Everything that happened tonight is already accounted for," he added, not as a warning, but as a fact, and in that instant, the room understood something it had not before, that this night had never been invisible, that every action, every decision, every word had been part of something larger than any of them realized. And as the silence settled once more, heavier now, more permanent, Ethan took a single step forward, his presence no longer questioned, no longer dismissed, and in a voice that remained calm, but carried a weight no badge could replicate, he said, "Now we begin." The word begin did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, the kind of weight that changes how people stand, how they breathe, how they think about what comes next, because moments like this do not announce themselves with noise. They arrive quietly, and then everything shifts around them. Ethan Cole did not raise his voice, did not move quickly. He simply turned slightly, his eyes scanning the room again, not searching, not questioning, but assessing, as if every detail had already been noted, and this was just confirmation. "Officer Ruiz," he said calmly, and Daniel straightened almost instinctively. "Yes, sir." The word came out before he even realized it. Not forced, not rehearsed, just natural, because authority does not always come from volume. Sometimes it comes from certainty. "Please secure all body camera footage from the last 12 hours, Ethan continued, his tone even, "and make sure nothing is altered or removed." Daniel nodded immediately, already moving toward the terminal, his hands steady but his mind racing, because now the instructions were no longer abstract. They were specific, they were real, and they were happening in front of him. Across the room another officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward Ryan as if waiting for a counter-command. But none came. Ryan remained still, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on Ethan, trying to read something, trying to find a point of resistance, but finding none, because this was no longer a situation he could control. Ethan stepped closer to the center of the room, his presence quiet but undeniable. "All reports filed tonight will be reviewed," he said, not looking at anyone in particular, yet addressing everyone, including initial stops, detainments, and procedural decisions. The words were simple, but they reached deeper than anyone expected, because procedures are where habits live, and habits are where patterns hide. A subtle tension moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but present, like a pressure building just beneath the surface. One officer cleared his throat slightly, another adjusted his stance, small movements that revealed more than words could. Ethan paused for a brief moment, not for effect, but because he understood something they did not yet. That silence can be more revealing than questions. And then he spoke again, softer this time. "If there is anything that needs to be clarified," he said, "now would be the time." No one answered, not because there was nothing to say, but because they did not yet know what could be said. The rules had changed, and no one had been told how. Ryan finally stepped forward, not aggressively, not confidently, but deliberately. "You are saying this entire shift is under investigation?" he asked, his voice controlled. But the edge was different now, less certain. Ethan met his gaze without hesitation. "I am saying this shift will be documented exactly as it occurred," he replied. And that distinction mattered, Because investigation implies doubt, but documentation implies truth, and truth does not negotiate. Ryan held that gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small motion, but one that carried more weight than any argument could have, because acceptance does not always come from agreement. Sometimes it comes from recognition. Across the room, Daniel's voice broke the silence again. "Footage is being backed up now," he said, his tone steady, focused, and for the first time since the night began, the system was no longer moving on instinct. It was moving on record. Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging the update, then turned toward the hallway briefly, his eyes resting for just a moment on the path that had led him here. The same path where hours earlier he had been dismissed, judged, reduced to something smaller than he was, and yet he showed no sign of holding on to that moment, no trace of resentment, because this was never about a single interaction. It was about something larger, something deeper, something that had been unfolding long before tonight, and would continue long after it ended. When he turned back, his expression remained calm, composed, but there was something else there now, something clearer, something final. "We will proceed step by step," he said, his voice steady, grounding the room in something new, something unfamiliar but necessary. And as those words settled in, the station did not return to normal, because normal had just been replaced, quietly, completely, by something far more difficult to ignore. By the time the first hint of morning began to press faintly against the windows, the station no longer felt like the same place it had been just hours before, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because everything subtle had changed, the kind of change that settles into the air and refuses to leave. Ethan Cole stood near the center of the room, reviewing the first set of retrieved footage on the monitor, his expression unreadable but focused, while behind him the quiet tension continued to build, not loud, not chaotic, just present, like a pressure no one could shake. Daniel Ruiz worked steadily at the terminal, transferring files, verifying timestamps, double-checking logs, his movements precise, careful, because now every detail mattered. Every second accounted for. Across the room a few officers stood in low conversation, their voices barely above a whisper, glancing occasionally toward Ethan, toward Ryan, toward the screens that now held more weight than any spoken explanation could carry. Ryan Blake remained near the desk, arms crossed loosely, posture controlled. But his stillness was different now, no longer casual, no longer relaxed. It was the stillness of someone recalculating, someone trying to understand where the line had shifted and how far it had already moved. "You are taking this pretty far for one night," Ryan said finally, his voice even, measured, but carrying a quiet challenge beneath it. Ethan did not look up immediately, his eyes still on the screen as a short clip played, the image of flashing lights, the curb, the moment everything had started, and then he paused it, the frame frozen at the exact second that mattered, before turning slightly. "This did not start tonight," he replied, calm, direct. And that answer landed differently than Ryan expected, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the shift, into something larger, something that could not be contained within a single report. Ryan held his gaze, searching for hesitation, for uncertainty, for anything that could be pushed against. But there was none, only clarity, and clarity is difficult to argue with. "You are saying this has been building," Ryan said, and for the first time his tone carried something else, not resistance, but recognition. Ethan nodded once. "Patterns do not appear overnight," he said. "They repeat, until someone decides to look closely enough." The room grew quieter, if that was even possible, because now the words were no longer abstract. They were personal, they pointed inward, not outward. Daniel glanced briefly over his shoulder, then back to the screen. As another file finished processing, "All footage is secured," he said, his voice steady, anchoring the moment in something tangible. Ethan gave a small nod, then stepped closer to the monitor, gesturing slightly. "Play it from the beginning," he said, and the video rolled, not dramatically, not loudly, just a simple recording of events as they happened, unedited, uninterrupted, the kind of truth that does not need interpretation. As it played, no one spoke, no one moved more than necessary, because there is a difference between remembering something and seeing it, and that difference was unfolding in real time. Ryan watched without interruption, his eyes fixed on the screen, his expression controlled. But behind that control something else moved, something quieter, heavier, because what had once felt like instinct now looked different when seen from the outside. When placed in sequence, when stripped of assumption, the clip ended. The room remained silent, and for a moment no one seemed willing to break it. Ethan let the pause linger, not forcing a reaction, not demanding a response, because understanding does not come from pressure. It comes from recognition, and recognition takes time. Finally, he spoke again, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm authority that settled deeper than anything before. "This is where we start," he said, his gaze moving across the room, meeting each set of eyes, not accusing, not condemning, just present, and that presence alone carried more weight than any accusation could. Ryan exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he was holding, his posture shifting slightly, not in defeat, but in awareness, because there comes a point when the narrative you have relied on no longer holds, and when that happens, the only thing left is what actually occurred. And as the screen went dark again, resetting for the next file, the station stood on the edge of something none of them could step away from, something that had already begun, something that would not be undone. Morning did not arrive with sunlight alone. It arrived with clarity, the kind that settles into a room and refuses to leave, the kind that forces people to see what they have spent years avoiding. And inside the station, that clarity was now impossible to ignore. Ethan Cole stood beside the monitor as the next set of footage loaded, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, while the room behind him remained unusually quiet. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everyone understood that words no longer carried the same weight as what was about to be seen. "Run the full sequence," Ethan said calmly, and Daniel nodded. Pressing the key without hesitation, the screen flickered to life again, this time showing a different angle, a different moment, one that connected the earlier pieces into something more complete, more difficult to dismiss. Officers watched without speaking, their attention fixed, their expressions shifting in subtle ways as details became clearer, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real, and that reality carried more weight than any accusation could. Ryan Blake stood slightly behind the others now, no longer at the center, his eyes following the footage closely, his posture still controlled but no longer anchored in certainty, because certainty requires control, and control had quietly slipped away hours ago. As the video continued, patterns began to emerge, small decisions that once felt routine now appearing in sequence, building into something larger, something that could not be explained as coincidence, and that was the moment. The room changed again, not outwardly, not visibly, but internally, because recognition does not always show itself immediately. Sometimes it settles slowly, piece by piece, until it becomes impossible to deny. The clip ended, the screen paused, and for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, the silence heavier now, more permanent. Ethan let it sit, understanding that forcing a reaction would only weaken the truth that was already present. After a few seconds, he stepped forward slightly, his voice calm, measured. "This is not about a single moment," he said, his gaze moving across the room, meeting each set of eyes briefly. "It is about consistency." And that word landed differently, because consistency does not rely on interpretation, it relies on repetition, on record, on what can be seen again and again without changing. One of the officers shifted, glancing down at the floor. Another looked away from the screen entirely, small reactions, but enough to reveal that something deeper had taken hold. Ryan remained where he was, his jaw set, his eyes still on the frozen frame, but there was no challenge left in his stance, only calculation, only the quiet realization that this was no longer about defending a decision, it was about understanding its place within something larger. "So what happens now?" Ryan asked finally, his voice lower than before, not confrontational, not dismissive, just direct. And Ethan turned to face him fully, not rushing the answer, not softening it either. "Now we continue," he said, and the simplicity of those words carried more weight than anything more complex could have, because continuation meant there was more to see, more to understand, more that had already been set in motion long before this moment. Daniel cleared his throat slightly, breaking the stillness just enough. "There are additional files flagged," he said, his voice steady but quieter, from previous weeks. And that was when the shift became complete, because this was no longer contained. Within a single night, it extended backward, outward, into something none of them could step away from. Ethan gave a small nod, acknowledging what he already expected. Cue them, he said, his tone unchanged, and as Daniel moved to load the next set, the room seemed to settle into a new kind of stillness, one that was no longer uncertain, but aware that what they were about to see would not simply pass, would not be filed and forgotten, but would remain, would be reviewed, would matter. And as the next video prepared to play, Ethan's gaze lifted once more, not toward the screen, but toward the people in the room, the ones who had lived inside these patterns without naming them. And in that quiet moment before the footage began again, the truth was no longer approaching. It was already here, and there was no way left to look away. The next video did not need an introduction. It began quietly. Another night, another stop, another set of decisions that once felt ordinary, but now unfolded under a different lens. And as the footage played, the room no longer reacted with curiosity. It reacted with recognition, subtle at first, a shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a breath held just a second too long. Because when patterns reveal themselves, they do not shout, they settle, they connect, they make what once seemed separate feel unmistakably linked. Ethan Cole stood slightly apart from the screen now, not because he was disengaged, but because he did not need to be close to understand what was already clear. His attention moved between the footage and the room itself, observing not just what had been recorded, but how it was being received, how understanding was forming in real time. Daniel Ruiz continued working at the terminal, pulling up files, organizing them in sequence, his earlier hesitation replaced by a focused clarity, as if the role he was playing had finally come into focus. Across the room the quiet had deepened into something heavier, something settled, and even the smallest sound seemed out of place against it. The clip ended, another loaded, then another, each one adding not chaos, but structure, not confusion, but clarity, until the weight of it could no longer be dismissed as isolated. And that was the point. Not a single moment, not a single decision, but a pattern that spoke for itself. Ryan Blake stood, motionless, his eyes fixed forward, no longer searching for a flaw, no longer looking for something to push against, because there was nothing left to push, only something to face. How long has this been going on? He asked quietly, not to challenge, not to deflect, but because the answer now mattered in a way it never had before. Ethan turned slightly, meeting his gaze. Long enough, he replied. And the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any timeline could, because time was no longer the question, accountability was. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, the kind that does not need to be spoken to be felt. Ethan stepped forward once more, his presence steady, grounding. This is where responsibility begins, he said, not directing it at one person, but at the room as a whole. Not when someone is watching, but when someone finally sees. The words settled in, not as judgment, but as truth. And truth has a way of removing everything unnecessary until only what matters remains. Daniel glanced at the final file in the queue, then back at Ethan. That is everything from the past 30 days, he said, his voice steady. And for a moment, the room seemed to pause at the edge of something final, not an ending, but a turning point, because what had been uncovered could not be unseen, could not be ignored, could not return to routine. Ethan gave a slight nod, then looked around the room. One last time, not with authority alone, but with something deeper, something rooted in purpose. This is not about punishment, he said, his voice calm, measured. It is about correction. And that distinction mattered, because correction requires change, and change requires acknowledgement. Ryan lowered his gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not in defiance, not in surrender, but in something quieter, something closer to understanding. Because there are moments when a person realizes that what they believed about control, about certainty, about how things work, no longer holds. And in that realization, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Ethan turned toward the monitor as the final screen went still, the reflection of the room faintly visible across it. a room that no longer looked the same as it had just hours ago. And in that reflection, everything was clearer than it had ever been. And as the silence settled fully, no longer temporary, no longer uncertain, but complete, one truth remained, simple,